How was your day? Maybe you carried something heavy today, something no one else could see you holding. There was a soul who carried everything she had ever done. Her name doesn't matter yet, but her heart does. In Egyptian belief, the heart remembers everything. If today had a little of that, she knows where you've been. You don't have to account for anything tonight. Just rest. And listen. This story begins at the scales, where the heart is already being weighed. The heart sits on one side of the scales, a single feather on the other. The jackal-headed god watches. The scribes wait. The 42 judges do not breathe. If the heart is lighter than the feather, you cross. If it is heavier, the devourer waits. She is part lion, part crocodile, part hippopotamus. She is always hungry. She has been waiting since before the world had a name. The soul this night has been walking a long time, through 12 gates. Past guardians with names no one remembers unless they are written down. This is why Egyptians wrote the spells not for magic, for memory. Have you ever had to prove you were a good person to someone who had already decided otherwise? The soul at the scales knows that feeling. 3,500 years separate you. Tonight, not so much. Get comfortable now. The ancient Egyptians believed the dead could sleep in the Duat, in the corridor between worlds. Even the gods rested. Even Osiris closed his eyes. If you drift before the end, you are in excellent company. This is what we do here. Every week, one story, one night, one ancient world. Not a lecture, not a test. Just a fire and a story and you. Adjust your pillow, find your warmth. If you fall asleep before the soul reaches the field of reeds, Anubis won't mind. He's walked beside the sleeping since the beginning of the world. This is only the beginning of her story. What she carried through the 12 gates, that's still ahead. But not all of it tonight. Tonight, just this part, just this beginning. If tonight felt like something, subscribe. We'll be here next week. Another story, another night like this. Now back to hers. Her name was Nefertari, not the queen, another Nefertari, a maker of linen in a city by the Nile. She had lived 72 years. She had loved 3 people completely. She had done one thing she regretted. The one thing she regretted, she had never told her daughter she was proud of her. Not once in 72 years. She had felt it. She had simply never said it. The heart carries everything. That is the Egyptian belief. Not just your crimes, your silences, your loves, the things you meant to say. The 42 assessors will ask about all of it. When Nefertari died, it was morning. The Nile was high. Someone outside was singing. She noticed she was no longer afraid. And then she noticed she was no longer there. Anubis was waiting. He always is. Not frightening, just present. He had a voice like old stone and slow water. He said, "Do you know your name?" She did. That was the first thing required. She told him her name. He nodded once. Then he said, "Good. We have 12 gates ahead of us. Tell me something true about yourself." "Oh, well, we walk." Nefertari was born in the reign of a pharaoh, whose name she never learned to pronounce. That didn't matter. What mattered was the river. She had grown up beside it. Her mother made linen. Her grandmother made linen. The trade went back far enough that no one in her family remembered a time before it. She learned to read the threads before she learned to read words. There were things she was good at and things she was not. She was good at patience. She was not good at asking for help. She spent 72 years working around that particular wall. She married once. His name was Ka. He was a sculptor who worked on tomb walls, painting the things the dead would need. She had loved him for the way he talked about the dead, as if they were listening. He died young, a fever in the 3rd month of the inundation. She nursed him for 11 days. On the 12th day, she went to the river and stood there until dark. She didn't remarry. That surprised people. She was 31. She had another 40 years ahead. She simply decided that what she'd had was enough, and she didn't want a lesser version. She had one daughter, Meritaten, born before Ka died. Meritaten grew up quick, spoken and loud, and certain of everything. the opposite of her mother. Nefertari adored her completely and showed it badly. "You're too loud," she said, when she meant you're extraordinary. "Sit still," she said, when she meant you make every room better. The love was enormous. The translation failed every time. Maybe you know that feeling. The love that came out wrong. That arrived as correction when it meant to be wonder. Merititen married a boat builder, moved 6 hours upriver, came back for festivals and floods. Nefertari was proud of the distance too, in the way she was proud of everything. Quietly, from the wrong direction. Nefertari's linen was known across 3 markets. Priests bought it for temple cloth. She had an apprentice by the time she was 40. By 52, they both stayed. She made the burial linen for 7 people she knew. Each time, she worked slowly. She washed her hands before she began. She said their names while she worked. She did not explain this to anyone. She believed in Osiris the way she believed in the river. Not with drama, but with the assumption that it would be there when needed. She made her offerings. She said her prayers. She didn't worry much. What she worried about, in her later years, was simpler. Had she made enough? Taught the apprentices enough? Said enough to the people who needed to hear from her? Merititen visited the summer Nefertari turned 68. They sat on the roof in the evenings. They talked about the river, about the prices in the market, about Merititen's children. Nefertari almost said it then. Almost. The words formed, "I am so proud of you. I have always been so proud of you." She opened her mouth. She talked about the linen prices instead. That's the part that stays with you. Not the great failures. The small doors that stayed closed. Merititen left after 12 days. They embraced. Nefertari held on slightly longer than she meant to. Merititen noticed. She didn't say anything either. The next 4 years were quiet. Good work. The apprentices were excellent now. They needed her less each season. She took that as the success it was. At 71, she began to tire earlier. A cough that came with the cold months and didn't quite leave. She noticed and did not tell anyone. The apprentices knew before she told them. They started doing the heavy work without being asked. She let them. That was new. She sent word to Merititen in the spring. Not because she was frightened. She wasn't. Because she was tired of having said the wrong things. She had one more season, maybe. She wanted to try again. Here's the part the myths never make obvious. The Book of the Dead was not written for the dead. It was written for the living. So that while they still had time, they would understand what the heart carries to the scales. Merititen arrived in the early summer. She had been crying before she arrived. Her husband told Nefertari later. She came through the door dry-eyed, carrying bread and figs. That was her mother's daughter. They didn't speak about the letter. They sat together. They made linen, side by side, 2 looms, the rhythm they had never quite found finding them now, at the end. On the 3rd day Nefertari said it. She said, "I have always been proud of you." I don't think I ever said it correctly. Merititen kept weaving for 3 threads before she answered. She said, "I know. Then. I knew. Then. I just needed to hear it once." They went back to weaving. They were both crying. They didn't stop working. You've been there. Not exactly there, but somewhere close to it. Merititen stayed 6 weeks. It was the longest she had stayed since childhood. On the last morning, she took her mother's hands and held them for a long time. Nefertari died 3 weeks after Merititen left. The morning the Nile was high. Someone outside was singing. She was not alone. One of the apprentices was there, sleeping in the corner. She noticed she was no longer afraid. She noticed she was still there, but not in the room. The room was still visible, but distant. Like a painting she had seen once and was moving away from. Anubis was there. He had been there the whole time, she realized. In the corner by the door, patient as stone, patient as the river at low tide. He said, "Do you know your name?" She said it. Her full name, the one her mother had given her, the one she had used to sign her linen in the markets. "Good," he said. Tell me something true about yourself while we walk. She thought for a moment. Then she said, I was better at making things than saying them. He said, that will serve you well here. The Duat was not what she had expected. It was not dark. It smelled like the Nile at night. That specific combination of water and reed and something older beneath. She had always loved that smell. Anubis walked beside her, not ahead. He never rushed. That surprised her too. She had imagined death as urgent. It was not. It was very, very slow. She asked him how long this would take. He said, as long as it needs to. She said, that's not an answer. He said, no, but it's true. She asked him about Ka. He said, I remember him. He was very careful with walls. She started crying then, not from grief, she realized, from relief. He told her about the journey ahead. 12 gates. Each with a guardian. Each guardian had a name. She would need to know the names. Do you have the words? He asked. My apprentices buried the scroll with me, she said. The scroll appeared in her hand. She didn't understand how. Anubis said, Hair, what you need and what you have are the same thing. You'll see. She looked at the scroll. Her name was on it. Her full name, in her mother's handwriting. She stood there for a long time, reading her own name in her mother's hand. Anubis waited. He was very good at waiting. The Egyptians did not believe the soul was one thing. They believed it was 5. The Ka. The life force, the double, the part of you that needed feeding even after death. That was why offerings mattered. The Bay, the personality, the part of you that was distinctly, stubbornly you. The Egyptians painted it as a bird with a human head. The Ba could leave the tomb, could visit the places it loved, could sit by the river. The Ak, the transformed spirit, the part of you that, if the judgment went well, became something luminous and imperishable. The Ak was what you could become. It was the destination not given, earned. The Ren, your name. This is why Egyptians carved names everywhere. Destroy the name and you destroy the person. As long as your name is spoken, you live. Nefertari's name was in her mother's handwriting. She would not be destroyed. The shoot, the shadow. The Egyptians believed your shadow was as real as your body. It moved with you in the dot. At the scales, it stood beside you. You were never entirely alone. The first gate was made of cedar and copper and something else. A wood Nefertari couldn't name. It smelled like the workshop on cold mornings. She hadn't expected that. The guardian of the first gate had 7 names. Anubis whispered the first to her. She found the others in the scroll. She read them aloud, carefully, the way she had always read instructions before beginning a new weave. The gate opened. It sounded like the loom at the end of a long day, the release of tension from the threads. She recognized that sound too. Stay with this. It matters before the end. Every gate Nefertari passes, she is becoming lighter. Not because she is losing things. Because she is setting them down correctly. The second gate smelled like mud after rain. The third like her mother's cooking. Onions and oil and something sweet. She wept at the third gate, but passed it anyway. Weeping was not failing. Anubis said nothing when she cried. He didn't look away either. He simply continued walking beside her. That, she thought, was what the good guides do. The fourth gate required a spell she had never read before. She found it near the middle of the scroll. Her mother's handwriting ended there, replaced by a scribe's careful marks. Both had prepared her. The fifth gate had no guardian. It simply opened when she stood before it. Anubis said that happened sometimes. That some gates were already open for people who had spent a lifetime asking for nothing they hadn't earned. The sixth gate smelled of linen. Not her linen specifically, but the general smell of cloth and work and someone's patient hands. She put her hand on the gate before she read the spell, as if greeting an old friend. She thought about Ka at the sixth gate. He had painted some of these walls, she realized. Not these walls exactly, but ones like them. The art of his hands had prepared her world for death. Now death had the art of those walls in it. The seventh gate was the hardest. She will not say why, even here. Some gates are private. Anubis waited on the other side. She came through. That was what mattered. She came through, and Anubis was there, and they walked on. The 8th gate had a question. Not from a guardian, from the gate itself, carved in the lintel. "What did you make?" she read. She answered, "Cloth, and students, and one apology. I almost left too late." The 8th gate opened. She hadn't needed a spell. The 9th and 10th gates she passed in silence. Not because she was empty, but because she had said enough. Some truths are complete before they are spoken. The 11th gate was made of light. Not metaphorical light, actual light, the same quality as the hour before dawn. She had always loved that hour. She had always started work in that hour. She walked through without stopping. The light passed over her like water. On the other side, her shadow was sharper. Her bay, the bird that was her personality, flew once in a slow circle and settled on her shoulder. The 12th gate was different from all the others. There was no smell, no sound, no material she could name. It was simply the end of the corridor, and beyond it a room that was larger than the sky. Anubis stopped at the threshold. He said, "This is where I leave you for a moment." "The first part," she said. "What do you mean the first part?" He said, "I'll be at the scales." She asked him if she should be afraid. He thought for a moment, the longest pause he had made in the entire journey. Then he said, "The heart that goes to those scales, having told the truth, always finds it lighter than expected." She stepped into the hall. The 42 assessors turned to look at her. They had been waiting. They had been waiting since before she was born. Osiris sat at the far end on his green throne. She could see him, barely. He was too large for easy looking. But his eyes were visible, and they were patient in the way that only something eternal can be patient. Thoth stood to the left, the ibis, headed scribe, his palette ready. He would write down everything. He had never made an error. He had never needed to correct a single line. The scales stood at the center. One side held a feather, white, still, impossibly light. The other side was empty, waiting for her heart. Anubis was at the scales. He had said he would be. She noticed she had believed him. She noticed she had believed him the whole time. He reached into the space where her chest had been. She felt nothing, no pain, no cold. Only the specific feeling of being relieved of something very heavy that you had been carrying so long you stopped noticing its weight. He carried it to the scales. He placed it on the empty pan. The room did not breathe. The 42 assessors leaned forward. Even Thoth stopped preparing his brush. The scale moved. Nefertari had spent 72 years making linen. She had loved 3 people completely. She had made one apology almost too late, but not too late. She had said her name when she was asked. This moment is easy to miss, but it changes everything. The heart does not need to be light because it is empty. It needs to be light because it is honest. The scale steadied. Anubis read it. He looked at Thoth. Thoth began to write. He did not write the name of Ammit the Devourer. He wrote something else. From his green throne at the far end of the hall, Osiris opened his eyes fully for the first time. He looked at Nefertari, the linen maker. The mother who said it almost too late, the woman who kept weaving through her tears. He nodded once. Osiris spoke then. His voice was not loud, it had no need to be. It arrived the way the river arrives, without announcement, already present, already filling everything. He said her full name. All of it. The childhood name her mother used, and the workshop name the apprentices used, and the name Ka had called her, which no one else had known. He said all 3. She hadn't expected that. He said, "You made things that outlasted you. You loved imperfectly and kept trying. You told the truth when it was easier not to, and you did not tell it when silence was the kinder choice." He paused. The scales confirm it. Thoth finished writing. He showed the record to Osiris without comment. Osiris looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked back at Nefertari. "You may cross," he said. The hall changed. Or she changed. It was hard to say which. The lamplight became warmer. The columns seemed to step back. At the far end, a door opened that had not been there before. Anubis returned to her side. He said, "The next part is different. You won't need me the way you needed me before." She said, "Will you still be here?" He said, "I'm always here." She walked through. The sensation was like stepping from shadow into morning. A not sudden, but a gradual arrival. Like the hour she had always started work. The pre-dawn light, the loom waiting. Aru, the field of reeds. The Egyptians imagined the afterlife as Egypt, but the best version of it. The flood always high. The harvest always good. The work present but never exhausting. The people you loved findable. She stood at the edge and breathed it in. The smell was exactly the Nile at inundation. The smell she had loved since childhood. The smell that had been in the Duat. The smell that was apparently hers to keep. Her the human-headed bird of her personality, flew from her shoulder and circled once high. The way it had in the living world when she was very happy. She hadn't known that it remembered that. She heard, before she saw the sound of a loom. Somewhere in the field, someone was weaving. The rhythm was familiar. She had heard it for 40 years. It was her mother, seated at a loom under a sycamore tree, weaving the same pattern she had taught Nefertari when Nefertari was 7 years old. She looked up when she heard footsteps. They didn't say anything for a long time. They sat down under the sycamore together. The mother's hands went back to the loom. After a while, Nefertari's hands did too. This was how they had always talked best. Maybe you know that. The person you talk to best without words. The language that lives in a shared task. She asked about Ka. Her mother said, "Has been here? He comes by. He's working on a wall near the third tributary, painting the souls who crossed last season." Nefertari laughed. She hadn't known she still could. She found him before the day's light changed. Because in Aru, the light changes, but slowly, and always toward warmth. He was painting a woman crossing the third gate. The woman in the painting looked a little like Nefertari. He turned when he heard her. His face went through several things in quick succession: a surprise, then something he tried to suppress, then he stopped trying. He set down his brush. He said her name, the one only he had used. She said, "You painted me?" He said, "I've been painting you since I got here." She looked at the wall. There were many women crossing many gates. All of them had something of her hands. He had been leaving her messages in the paint. That's the part that stays with you. Not the scales. Not the gates. The wall of messages left by someone who found a way to keep reaching across the distance. In Aru, time moved differently. Not faster. Not slower. More honestly, the way a day moves when you have exactly what you need and nothing you don't. She found her grandmother near the river, arguing with a fisherman about the best time of day to cast. Her grandmother had been dead for 50 years. She was winning the argument. The loom her grandmother was using was the same loom from the workshop, or one identical to it. In Aru, such distinctions seemed beside the point. She asked if she could weave. Her grandmother handed her the shuttle without looking up from the argument. That was exactly right. She wove for what might have been hours or might have been days. The cloth was finer than anything she had made in life. Not because she was better, because here the thread cooperated. The apprentices, she was told, were still living, still weaving. She could feel that a warmth in the direction of the living world, faint but present, like a lamp burning in another room. She found, in Aru, that the one thing she regretted no longer weighed anything. Not because it had been erased, because she had addressed it. The heart, here, carried only what remained unfinished. She thought about Meritaten. The warmth in the direction of the living world was brightest there. Her daughter was alive and weaving. She could feel the rhythm of it, faintly, like music through a wall. She sent something back. Not words, she had no way of sending words, but the feeling, the pride, the enormous, poorly translated pride that had spent 40 years coming out as correction. She sent it directly this time. In the city by the Nile, Merititan was at her loom when she felt it. She couldn't have said what it was. She wept without knowing why, then went back to weaving. She felt, for reasons she couldn't explain, that she was not alone. That's the part that matters. The love that finally traveled without getting lost. The sycamore tree at the edge of Aru was where Isis sat sometimes. In the shape of a bird, a kite, wings spread, she sang for those who were newly arrived. Not loudly, just enough. Nefertari went to the tree at the end of her first day in Aru. She sat beneath it. Isis sang a something without words, something that sounded like the sound the river made at flood, the sound of a world giving generously. She stayed until she was ready to sleep. The Egyptians believed the dead slept in Aru, not from exhaustion, but from peace. It was a different kind of sleep, one you went into willingly. Before she slept, she thought once more of the heart on the scales. She thought of the feather. She thought, all my life I believed the measure of a person was what they made. The feather said something different. The feather said the measure is whether you were true, whether what you made came from an honest place, whether the love was real, even when the translation failed. She slept under the sycamore, her head against the roots, the river sound in the distance, the song of Isis fading slowly into something even quieter. Ka was there, and her mother, and they let her sleep. But the story is not only Nefertari's. The Book of the Dead was not written for one soul. It was written for everyone who would ever die. Which is everyone, which includes the people who wrote it. The scribes who wrote the Book of the Dead knew they were writing their own. Every spell they committed to papyrus was a spell they would one day need. They wrote carefully for that reason. The oldest copies of the Book of the Dead are more than 3,000 years old. They are in museums now. The spells still work, some Egyptians would tell you. Words that are true don't expire. In the Hall of Two Truths, while Nefertari slept under the sycamore, another soul arrived. A young man this time, a soldier, which complicated things. Soldiers had difficult hearts, not because they were bad men. Because war does things to a heart that peacetime cannot undo. The question the scales asked was not, did you kill? The question was, what did you carry afterward? He had carried his dead carefully. He had wept for them in private. He had been unable to explain why he survived when they did not. The scales felt the weight of that survivor's grief. It was heavy, but it was honest. The 42 assessors asked their questions. He answered each one. Not perfectly, none of them answered perfectly. But truthfully, and in Egypt, truth was the only currency that mattered. His heart was heavier than Nefertari's. The scales showed it. But heavy is not the same as false. The feather of Malat does not measure weight, it measures truth. The scale held. He crossed. In Aru, he found the men he had wept for. They had been waiting, not with accusation. Just with the patience of those who have had time to understand things the living cannot yet understand. The Egyptians understood something the living world often forgets, that grief is not weakness. That carrying your dead carefully is its own kind of courage. The scales knew this, Mot knew this. In Aru, the soldier and his men built something together, a wall, as it happened, near Ka's tributary. They didn't know each other, but builders recognize builders. Nefertari woke from her first sleep in Aru to the sound of construction. She smiled. She had always liked that sound. She went back to sleep. The boat of Ra passed overhead, of the sun god's barge crossing the Duat every night, carrying the sun from west to east through the world beneath the world. Those in Aru sometimes watched it, a comfort like a lamp in a familiar room. The Book of the Dead was not always called that. The Egyptians called it the spells for going forth by day. Going forth. Not going under, not descending. Forth into light, into the next thing, into continuation. The earliest versions were carved on coffins, the coffin texts. Before that, on the walls of pyramids, of the pyramid texts. The Egyptians had been writing the same essential thing for more than 4,000 years. The same essential truth The dead need to remember who they are. By the new kingdom of the Egypt of Rameses and Tutankhamun, the spells were on papyrus. Portable. Personal. You could commission your own copy, with your name inserted wherever the text said, "the deceased." The Egyptians made even death individual. Some copies had the name left blank, mass-produced, bought at market, the name filled in hastily before burial. The gods, apparently, accepted this. The Egyptians were practical people. What they all shared, the pyramid carvings and the blank market copies, was the same understanding. That death requires preparation. That the prepared soul moves through the gates more easily. That knowing your name is the first step in every journey. In Aru, Nefertari began a new weave. She had no pattern in mind. She let the thread decide. This was new. In life, she had always planned before she began. Ka came and watched. He didn't say anything. He picked up his brush after a while and began to paint what he saw, the linen. Maker working without a plan. The cloth going where it wanted. It was the best thing he had ever painted. She asked him later what it was like, dying young. He said it was like being cut off mid-sentence. He said the hardest part was not knowing how the sentence ended. She told him how it ended. She told him about Meritaten. He had known her for only 3 years before he died. She was barely walking. Nefertari told him everything. It took a long time. In Aru, there was time for that. When she told him about the loom, about the 6 weeks when they wove side by side, about the words finally said, Ka set down his brush again. He said, "I knew she'd wait for you." Nefertari said, "You knew better than I did." The days in Aru had a rhythm she recognized. Work in the morning, the river at midday, the evening under the sycamore, sleep when the boat of Ra passed. She had wanted this in life and never quite managed it. She thought sometimes about the apprentices. She thought they have the craft now. The whole of it. Whatever I understood about thread, they understand too. That's the part that continues. She had made temple linen for the god Osiris, as it happened. 3 bolts of the finest she had ever woven, sent to the temple for a festival offering 14 years before she died. She had never thought much about it. Here, Osiris mentioned it. "It was very fine linen," she said. "Thank you," he said. "It still is." She understood then that what you give here remains what it was when it was given. The quality of the offering preserved. He stayed for a while, Osiris sitting under the sycamore like anyone at rest. She asked him once if he was ever lonely. He said, "I have everyone who ever lived and everyone who ever will." She said, "That's not an answer." He said, "No." "But it's true." Anubis visited too eventually. He seemed smaller in Aru, not diminished, but more himself. Less the guide, more the being that the guide was made from. He sat with her. He didn't say much. She asked him how many souls he had walked through the Duat. He thought about it. He said, "All of them." She said, "Does it get easier?" He said, "It gets more true." She thought that was a very good answer. She wove him something, a small piece of linen, the finest she could make in Aru. He accepted it without ceremony. He tucked it somewhere in his robes. She didn't ask where. Time passed in Aru. More souls arrived. More gates opened. More hearts were weighed. The hall of 2 truths was never empty. The scales were never still for long. Nefertari watched them arrive sometimes from her place under the sycamore. She could see the edge of the field, where the new ones came through. She remembered that feeling. She waved when she could. One afternoon, a woman arrived at the field's edge looking lost. She was young, too young. She had the look of someone who had not expected to be here yet. Nefertari went to her. She sat with the young woman. She didn't explain anything. She asked her name. The young woman said it. Nefertari said, "Good, you'll need that." She stayed until the young woman was ready to go to the sycamore. Then she let her go. She had always known when to let people find their own way. That was a craft too. In the living world, Meritaten named her youngest daughter Nefertari. She told the child about the loom, about the linen that went to temples, About the 6 weeks they spent weaving side by side. The child listened very carefully. In Aru, Nefertari felt it. The name spoken by the grandchild she had never met. In the voice of the daughter, she had almost left without saying the right thing. She felt it the way you feel warmth from a fire you can't quite see. The Rame. As long as it is spoken, you live. The Egyptians had understood this with their whole civilization. Now Nefertari understood it with her whole self. She wove a small cloth for the grandchild she would never meet in life. She left it at the edge of the field, where the living world was closest. Whether it arrived, she didn't know. Some things you send without certainty. That is what the Book of the Dead understood. That love does not require certainty. That the gesture matters independent of whether it reaches. The Egyptians were not sentimental. They were something better. Here's the part most retellings miss. The judgment was not the end of the Book of the Dead. Passing the scales was not graduation. Aru was not retirement. It was a continuation of exactly who you had been, only with the parts that were unfinished, finally finished. Nefertari had spent 72 years being better at making than saying. In Aru, she was learning to say, not replacing the making, adding the saying to it. But once, Ka said she talked more. She said, I have more to say. He said, you always did. She thought about that for a while. The boat of Ra passed every night. It never missed. The dead found comfort in that, of the regularity of the sun's passage. The knowledge that the living world above was still receiving its light, still waking, still going on. Ra himself was not old in the dot. He was young, the young sun, who became the old sun by the time he reached the western horizon, and was young again in the morning. The Egyptians saw no contradiction in this, because to them, death was not the opposite of life. It was the other half of it. The Nile flooded and receded. The wheat grew and was harvested. The sun set and rose. Everything that ended returned. Everything that returned had ended. Nefertari understood this. She had woven it, in a way. Every piece of cloth had a beginning and an end, and between them, a pattern. The cloth was not diminished by having an end. It was completed by it. She had been in Aru long enough now to see the seasons change. The flood, the planting, the harvest, as reflected in the warmth and abundance of the field. She had begun to teach again. The young woman from the field's edge was learning to weave. This moment is easy to miss, but it changes everything. The craft she had been afraid was too specific, too small, too ordinary to matter. It was exactly what was needed, not despite its ordinariness, because of it. What the Book of the Dead asks of the 42 assessors is not whether you were important, not whether you were remembered, not whether you were great. Only were you true? Were you honest with what you had? Nefertari had been a linen maker. She had been imperfect at love. She had almost left the most important thing unsaid. And she was here, a teaching again, weaving again, recognized by the God who received her offering. Because she had been true, not perfect, not important, not famous, true. And the feather, the lightest thing in any world, had found her heart light enough. Back in the Hall of Two Truths, another heart waited on the scales. Anubis stood at the balance. Thoth prepared his brush. Osiris opened his eyes. The 42 assessors leaned forward. This was the moment that never stopped. That had never stopped since the first Egyptian drew breath and understood. Eventually, she would stop. There came a heart not Nefertari's, another Zar, that had been waiting the longest. A man who had died in the 14th year of a pharaoh's reign, whose name the man had never learned either. He had been waiting in the dot for 11 years. He had waited because he was not sure. Not because he had done terrible things. Because he had done complicated things. Because the line between what was necessary and what was wrong had blurred in ways he hadn't been able to resolve while living. Anubis removed his heart. It was heavier than Nefertari's, heavier than the soldiers. It went on the scale and the pan dropped. And everyone in the hall held whatever it was they held instead of breath. Amit moved. For the first time in the story, she moved. Part lion, part crocodile, part hippopotamus. She stepped forward from the shadow. She was always hungry. She had been waiting longer than the soul had. Then the scale steadied, not balance, not even close to balance, but steadied, stopped moving. The pan descended no further, because the heart, heavy as it was honest. The complications were real. The blurring was real. He had not lied about any of it, not even to himself. Amit stopped. Anubis read the scale. Thoth began to write. Not the devourer's name, something else. The man let out the breath he had been holding for 11 years. The man with the heavy heart crossed into Aru. He stood at the field's edge for a long time. He hadn't expected it to be beautiful. He had expected something more like the Duat corridors. Gates' judgment. Not wheat. Not the smell of the river. Nefertari saw him from the sycamore. She recognized the particular stillness of someone who has just arrived and does not know where to put the 11 years of waiting. She went to him. She didn't explain anything. She asked his name. He said it. She said, "Good, you'll need that." He looked at her. He said, "Someone told me that once already." She said, "It bears repeating." His name was Userhat. He had been a grain measurer, the man who weighed the harvest, determined what was owed to the temple and what remained for the farmer. He had tried to be accurate. He had not always been. He told Nefertari about it at the sycamore. The times he had rounded in his favor. Not dramatically, never dramatically, just slightly. Just enough to make certain seasons easier. He had never been able to decide if that was corruption or survival. She said, "The scale held." He said, "I know." She said, "What does that tell you?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That it was still a question. But an honest question. Maybe you know that feeling. The thing you couldn't resolve. The question you kept turning over. Here, at least, the honest turning counts for something." Userhat found work in Aru that suited him. The harvest still needed measuring. The Egyptians had imagined an afterlife with grain and flood and work, because they could not imagine a good life without those things. He measured honestly here. There was no pressure otherwise. He and Nefertari became friends. The linen maker and the grain measurer. The two people who had spent their lives weighing things. They had, it turned out, a great deal to say to each other. In the Hall of Two Truths, the work continued. Anubis at the scales, Thoth at his pallet, Osiris on his throne, the 42 assessors in their seats. The river of the dead moving always in the same direction. Then something happened that had not happened before. A soul came through the 12th gate and did not know her name. "Do you know your name?" She looked at him. She said, "I think I had one." He said, "You did. Everyone does." She said, "I can't remember it." She had arrived without a scroll, without the book of the dead, without anyone who had written her name down, buried it with her, preserved it in stone or paint or linen or the memory of a grandchild. She had arrived with only herself, and she had forgotten even that. This was not corruption. This was not dishonesty. She had been a slave, one of the many who built and served and were not given scrolls, not given names in stone, not given the preparation that required wealth and time, and someone who cared to provide it. The Hall of Two Truths went very quiet. Even the assessors who had seen everything went still. This was the question the Book of the Dead had never fully answered. What happens to the one who arrives without a name? Anubis did not remove her heart. Not yet. He said, "Walk with me." He took her back into the Duat, and not forward but back, into the corridor, to find what she had lost. Here's the part the myths never make obvious. The Duat held memory. Every soul that passed through left something of itself in the corridor, a warmth, a scent, a sound. The corridor remembered what the soul had forgotten. At the third gate, she stopped. The third gate smelled of cooking, of the universal smell of food prepared with care. She stood there for a long time. Then she said, "Someone called me something when I was small, before the work." Anubis waited. He was very good at waiting. She said my mother called me something. Before my mother was taken, before I was taken. She pressed her hand to the gate. She said a word, quietly, as if testing it. Anubis said, "Say it again." She said it again, louder. It was a name, an old name from before the work. From before the life that had been lived in the service of others with no one to preserve her. Her name. The corridor held it. The name stayed in the air. She said it a third time, and this time something shifted. The gate that had been behind her, the third gate, opened a second time, only for a moment, long enough. She turned to Anubis. He was already walking back toward the hall. He said, "Come, you have your name now?" She said, "Will that be enough?" He said, "It was always enough. You just needed to find it." In the Hall of Two Truths, she stood before the scales. The assessors were silent. This heart, Anubis placed with particular care. It was the heart of someone who had worked hard and been seen by no one who mattered. Heavy, yes, but not false. Osiris leaned forward on his throne. That had not happened before, not in the memory of anyone in the hall. He leaned forward and looked at the scales. Then he looked at her. He said, "I know your name. I have always known your name. The living world failed to write it down. That is their failure. Not yours." The scale steadied. Thoth began to write, not the devourer's name. She crossed into Aru. She stood at the edge of the field. The wheat was high. The Nile was running. A woman was coming toward her from the direction of the sycamore tree. Nefertari asked her name. She said it. Clearly. It was the first time she had said it clearly in her life. In life, names like hers were not said clearly. Here there was no reason to say it any other way. That's the part that matters. The name that was forgotten by the world, remembered by the god, recovered by the corridor, spoken clearly by the person herself. The Ren persists. It always persists. In the Hall of Two Truths, Osiris sat back on his throne. The ordinary work resumed. But Thoth, who recorded everything, added a note to his record, the first amendment he had made in the history of the hall. He wrote, "The living world does not determine what the scales see." Anubis stood at the balance and waited for the next heart. There was always a next heart. He was patient. He had always been patient. He had walked beside every hand that trembled in the dark, and he would walk beside every hand still to come. That was what it meant to be the guide. The woman who recovered her name settled into Aru with a quietness that was different from the others. Not sadness, a completeness. She had arrived with nothing and found the one thing that mattered. Everything after was abundance. Nefertari gave her linen. Not the cloth she had made for the gods, simpler than that. The linen a person needs to be comfortable. The woman accepted it without ceremony. That felt right. She asked Nefertari what the work was like, a weaving. She had never learned. Her hands had spent their life on different tasks. Nefertari showed her. The woman was not immediately good at it. She kept going. In Aru, the work you had never had time for, that was available too. The Egyptian afterlife was not rest from all labor. It was rest from all urgency. The difference was everything. Userhat, who had spent his life measuring things, began to learn to paint. Ka taught him. Ka was patient with beginners. He had always been patient. It was part of why his tomb paintings had lasted. Ka said the most important thing about painting was also the most important thing about weighing grain. Your eye had to be honest before your hand could be accurate. Userat said that was the most useful thing anyone had said to him in either life or death. Nefertari watched them and thought this is what the Egyptians were trying to say. Not that the afterlife was a reward. That it was the continuation of becoming what you were always trying to be. The grandmother was still arguing with the fisherman. It had been, by Aru's reckoning, a long argument. Both of them seemed to be enjoying it. The fish, apparently, had an opinion too. There were animals in Aru. The Egyptians had loved their animals, cats above all, but also dogs, ibises, the cattle that made the harvest possible. In the field they were all present. The cats particularly seemed pleased with themselves. Nefertari had not had a cat in life. The workshop was not suited to it. In Aru, a cat arrived and chose her. She accepted this without surprise. It seemed the kind of thing that would happen here. She asked Anubis on one of his visits about the cats. He said, "They chose this. Everything here that is here, chose to be here." She said, "The cat chose me." He said, "The cat always chooses?" She had been curious since arriving about Osiris himself, about the god who sat on the green throne and saw everything. She had spoken to him once. Briefly, she wanted to understand him better. She asked Anubis, "What is he like when he is not on the throne?" Anubis was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He is the same. He has always been exactly the same, even before he died." Osiris had died. That was the thing the Egyptians never let you forget. The god of the dead had been a living king. He had been murdered by his brother Set, cut into pieces scattered across Egypt. He had been reassembled by love. Isis gathered the pieces. She searched all of Egypt. She found them one by one, in marshes and deserts and cities, and she brought them back. And she held them together until they were whole again. The Egyptians told this story because they knew something. That everything falls apart eventually. And that the only question that matters, is whether someone loves you enough to gather the pieces. Maybe you know someone like that. Someone who has gathered your pieces. Or someone whose pieces you have gathered. The Egyptians made a god of it. Osiris, reassembled, became the first mummy, the first preserved body, the first person who had died and been prepared for what came after. That was why the Egyptians preserved their dead, because Osiris had shown it was possible to continue. He became the judge because he had been the judged. He knew what it was to be weighed. He had been weighed by the very fact of his death. An unjust death, a violent death, a death that should not have happened to a good king. The scales of Ma'at were his answer to what had been done to him. Not revenge, precision. He had been wronged by chaos, by Set's chaos, by the disorder of murder and ambition. He chose truth as the corrective. Nefertari thought about this for a long time. She thought he could have chosen revenge. He chose truth instead, and then she thought, that's the part that made him a god worth worshipping. She thought about Set, the brother who murdered, the chaos god, the one who scattered Osiris across Egypt and believed that scattered meant finished. He had been wrong about that. Set was not in Aru. Set was not in the Duat. Set was elsewhere. The Egyptians were careful about what they said about elsewhere, but they were clear that chaos, in the end, finds itself alone. Isis came to Aru sometimes. Not often. She had work in the living world still, watching over those who called on her. But when she came, the sycamore filled with birds. Every bird in Aru came to the tree when Isis arrived. She and Osiris sat under the tree together when she came. They didn't always speak. The Egyptians understood this, that the deepest love often lives in silence, in the willingness to simply be in the same place. Nefertari watched them once from a distance. She thought of Ka. She thought even gods have the same story. The love interrupted, the gathering, the quiet of being beside the one who gathered you. She went back to Ka. She sat beside him while he painted. He didn't look up. He said, "You were thinking about something large." She said, "Less." He said, "Good. The large things are what the paint is for. The large things are what the paint is for." She turned that over for a long time. She thought, "And what is the linen for?" She went back to her loom. She began a new piece, very large, the largest she had ever attempted. The woman who had recovered her name came to watch. She had been learning. Her weaving was still imperfect, but she sat beside Nefertari and worked her own piece alongside the large one. Two weavers at their looms, the craft doubling. Userhat came by and asked what the large cloth was for. Nefertari said she didn't know yet. He said, "That's the most honest answer I've heard since I got here." She said, "Then I must be learning something." She finished the large cloth in what Aru's time considered an afternoon. In the living world, it would have taken months. Here, The intention and the completion were closer together. The craft cooperated with the intention. She offered it to Osiris, not because she had to, because she wanted to. He received it as he had received her previous offering, with the simple acknowledgement of a god who recognizes honest work. He said, "Still very fine linen." She laughed. He looked at her very slightly surprised. Gods in the Egyptian tradition were not often laughed at. She said, "That is exactly what you said the last time." He said, "It was true the last time. It is true now." She thought later the gods of Egypt were not distant. They were precise. They were present in the flood and the harvest, and the weight of grain, and the fine thread. They were in everything that required honesty of hand. And the dead, she thought, were not separate from that. They were the record of it. Every soul in Aru was the record of a life of honest or dishonest work, of love well or badly translated, of names said or unsaid. The field remembered all of it. She had been in Aru long enough now that the new arrivals sometimes came to her first. The woman from the field's edge, now a real weaver, came with her. Together they went to the edge for the bewildered and the newly arrived. One afternoon, a very old man arrived at the edge. He had lived, he said, 94 years. He was not bewildered at all. He said, "Oh, good. I've been looking forward to this." Nefertari liked him immediately. He asked where the river was. She pointed. He said, "Good. I've always been happiest near water." He walked toward it without looking back. He knew exactly where he was going. Some souls arrived already home. She thought about him for a while. She thought he had his whole life to prepare. Not with scrolls, with living, with honesty, with going toward the water he loved and not away from it. Some people write the book of the dead in how they spend their days. Maat was not only for the dead. The Egyptians brought her into every part of their living world. Pharaohs were crowned in her name. Courts dispensed justice in her name. The word Ma'at meant truth, justice, harmony, and balance all at once, a single concept that English requires 4 words to approximate. When a pharaoh was crowned, he received a small figure of Ma'at and was told he was responsible for maintaining her. Not worshipping her, maintaining her. The king was the custodian of truth. The moment he failed that, he failed everything. Egyptian courts of law were conducted in the presence of Ma'at, her symbol, her image, her feather. The accused and the accuser both stood before truth, not before the king. Before truth, the king was just the instrument. Ma'at was why the Egyptians were uncomfortable with lying, not only because it was wrong, but because it introduced chaos. Set's domain. Every lie was a small act of chaos. Every truth was a small act of Ma'at. The world was maintained or not, one exchange at a time. The Egyptians believed you could live your way to the field of reeds, not by being perfect, by maintaining Ma'at, by telling the truth when it was easier to lie, by measuring honestly when you could have rounded, by saying the thing that needed to be said, even when it was hard, one exchange at a time. In Aru, Nefertari understood Ma'at the way she understood linen, not theoretically, but in the hands. She had maintained her version of Ma'at in the workshop. Honest thread counts. Fair prices. Cloth that was what it claimed to be. She had not thought of it as Ma'at at the time. She had thought of it as doing the work correctly. That, she understood now, was the same thing. Ma'at was not a special practice. It was the ordinary practice done without compromise. The cat had opinions about the weaving. It sat on the cloth whenever the opportunity arose. Nefertari moved it each time. The cat returned each time. This too felt like Ma'at, the patient correction, the gentle insistence, the system maintaining itself. Anubis laughed at the cat. She had not known he could laugh. It was a sound like wind through a canyon, dry and deep, and entirely genuine. She filed this away as one of the more important things she had learned in Aru. She asked him once, "Does anyone fail? Does anyone go to Amit?" He was quiet for a long time, longer than usual. Then he said, "Yes, rarely. But yes," she said. "What does that feel like?" He said, like a conversation that couldn't find its honest ending. She thought about that for a long time. A conversation that couldn't find its honest ending. She thought about all the conversations in her life that had struggled toward honesty and mostly found their way there. She was glad of each one now. The workshop of the dead in Aru was busy. Every craft that had ever been practiced honestly was represented. Bakers and brewers and sculptors and sailors and farmers. The field was enormous. There was room for all of it. Nefertari visited the baker once. The bread in Aru was, as everything in Aru, was the best version of itself. The baker said he had spent his whole life trying to make this bread. He had come very close in his last year. Here, he had it exactly. She thought this is what the Egyptians promised. Not streets of gold. Not eternal rest. The thing you spent your life making finally made the way you meant it. That was the field of reeds. The Nile in Aru was always at the right level. Not flood, not drought. The exact level the farmers needed. The Egyptians had spent 3,000 years watching the real Nile and knowing that the right level was not guaranteed. In Aru, it was. That was what made it paradise. She asked the farmers what they grew. They told her everything. Wheat, barley, flax. She asked about the flax, as she had always bought her flax. She had never grown it. They offered to show her. She grew a small plot of flax beside her loom. She harvested it herself. She spun the thread herself. She wove cloth from thread she had grown from seed. For the first time, she had made the entire thing. It was not as fine as her best work. She didn't care. She kept that piece of cloth. She didn't offer it to anyone. It was the first thing in 72 years of making that she kept entirely for herself. That felt like Mott too. Time in Aru had a different texture now. She had been here long enough that it no longer felt like arrival. It felt like home. The way the workshop had felt like home. The way the Nile had felt like home. The way the smell of the river at flood had always felt like the right beginning of a day. She thought sometimes about the living world. Not with longing. She had done that in her first weeks and let it settle. But with interest. The way you think about a place you have left and loved and know is still going. Meritedin was getting old now in the living world. Nefertari could feel it not as loss, but as a kind of readiness. She thought, when you are ready, I will be at the edge. Nefertari of the Lenin, the loom, the love that came out wrong and then came out right, she would be at the edge. She told Anubis. He said, she'll pass through my hands first. Nefertari said, I know, be gentle with her. She's always been loud, but she's not as certain as she sounds. He said, I know. I've been watching her since she was born. That stopped her, she said. You've been watching her. He said, I watch everyone. I have watched you since the day you were born too. I was there when you said the wrong thing to your mother. And when you said the right thing to your daughter. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, you saw the day I didn't say it. He said, I saw the day you did. She thought, that is what a good guide keeps, not the failures. What came after? The seasons in Aru turned slowly. The flax grew and was harvested. The wheat grew and was harvested. The boat of Ra passed every night. The Hall of Two Truths continued its eternal work. Nefertari wove. She finished many pieces. She gave most of them away. She kept the cloth made from her own flax. And a small piece she had woven the day she arrived in Aru. Before she knew she was weaving, the loom had been there and her hands had begun. The woman who recovered her name had become a real weaver by now. She had surpassed Nefertari's second apprentice in precision and was approaching the first. She had a gift for pattern, something Nefertari had always been better at executing than inventing. Nefertari watched her and thought, she has already passed me in this, and felt nothing but gladness. That too was new. In life, she had been competitive in ways she had never admitted. Here, the gladness was clean. She told her, she said, you're past me in this. The woman said, I had a good teacher. Nefertari said, you had a beginning. The rest was you. That was honest. That was Ma'at. In the Hall of Two Truths, a heart arrived that worried even Anubis. Not because it was dishonest, because it was broken in a specific way. It belonged to someone who had never believed he deserved to be here, who had spent his entire life convinced he was not good enough. He had been a kind man, a generous man, a man who had given nearly everything he had to everyone who asked, and who had believed all his life that this wasn't enough, that he wasn't enough. That belief had made his heart heavy in a way that wasn't dishonesty but resembled it. The assessors asked their 42 questions. He answered all of them honestly, and then added to each answer. But perhaps that wasn't enough. The assessors had never encountered this before. Osiris spoke then. He said, "The qualification is not part of the answer. The answer stands alone. The scales do not weigh what you thought of your own goodness. They weigh whether your goodness was real." The man said, "Was it?" Osiris said, "Look at the scale." The scale had settled. The heart, qualified and doubted and dismissed all his life, was lighter than he believed. Thoth wrote, not the devourer's name. He stood there for a long moment. He said, "I was enough." Osiris said, "You always were." He said, "I spent my whole life not knowing that." Osiris said, "Many do. The scale always knew. Maybe you know that feeling too. The suspicion that you are not enough." The scale, if it could speak to the living, would tell you what it told him. The measurement was always more generous than the measurer. He crossed into Aru. At the edge, Nefertari was waiting. She had begun to be there for the ones who arrived looking like they didn't expect to arrive. She had learned to recognize that particular posture. He had it exactly. She asked it, he told her.
She said,
"Good. You'll need that," he said. "I'm not sure I deserve to be here," she said. The scale was. He looked at her. He said, "Is that enough?" She said, "It was always enough." She walked him to the sycamore. She introduced him to Ka, who shook his hand, and to Userhat, who immediately asked what he had done in life. He said, "I helped people." Usert said, "That sounds straightforward." He said, "It never felt that way." Userhat said, "Nothing worthwhile does." They sat under the sycamore together. The cat appeared and immediately chose the new arrival. He looked at the cat. He looked at Nefertari. He said, "So right?" She said, "Yes." He let out a breath that had been held for his whole life. When Napoleon's armies entered Egypt in 1798, they found a civilization that had been silent for 1,000 years. The temples, the tombs, the papyri all waiting. Among the first things they carried back to Europe, the Book of the Dead. The Europeans had never seen anything like it. It took decades to decipher. The Rosetta Stone unlocked the hieroglyphs, and suddenly 3,000 years of Egyptian writing became readable. The first clear translations of the Book of the Dead came in the 1840s. Scholars wept, some of them. What they found was not the dark religion they had expected. They found the most detailed, most human vision of the afterlife ever written down. A world that looked like Egypt. A judgment that asked about honesty, not perfection. A God who had himself been murdered and reassembled by love. The Book of the Dead influenced everything that came after. The Christian concept of the Last Judgment, of the weighing of souls, carries the Egyptian understanding in its bones. The scales of justice, still used in courts today, are Ma'at's scales. The feather is still in the balance. The oldest surviving Book of the Dead belongs to a man named Ani, a royal scribe who lived around 1300 BCE. His copy is in the British Museum now. It is 23 meters long. Ani's name is in it. As long as it is read, he lives. In Aru, Nefertari felt something she had not felt before. A distance contracting. The warmth from the living world, from Meritaten, suddenly very close. And then Anubis was at the edge of the field. She said, "Is it her?" He said, "Walk with me to the edge." She said, "She passed?" He said, "She is passing." She said, "I want to be there." He said, "That's why I came." She waited at the edge. The warmth grew. Then not the way it had been described, not the way she had imagined her own crossing, of a sound. Loud a voice, Meritedin's voice, speaking her name. Meritedin arrived at the field's edge still talking. She had been in the middle of something, still arguing a point with someone on the other side of the boundary. She arrived the way she had always arrived everywhere, fully, loudly, before anyone was entirely ready. She saw Nefertari and stopped talking mid-sentence. First time in her life. Her face went through several things. Then she said, Nefertari said, "I've been here a while." Meritedin said, "Were you waiting?" Nefertari said,
"Yes."
Meritedin wept then. Not quietly, she had never done anything quietly. Nefertari held her. She held on longer than she meant to. Meritedin noticed. She didn't say anything about it. She just held on too. Meritedin said, into her shoulder, "I felt you. After you died, I was at the loom and I felt something. I didn't know what it was." Nefertari said. Meritedin said, "Was that you?" Nefertari said,
"Yes."
Meritedin said, "And the grandchild, my youngest, she felt something too when she was small. She would look at her loom and smile for no reason." Nefertari said, "Tell her, when you can, that she was right to smile." She introduced Meritedin to Ka. Meritedin looked at him for a long time. She had only her mother's stories. "He was exactly as described," she said. Nefertari said, "He painted you. He's been painting you since he arrived." Ka showed her the wall. She walked its length slowly, her hand along the paintings. She found herself in almost every figure. In the way a hand was held, in the angle of a shoulder. He had been painting her from her mother's descriptions. She was 40, 5 years of paint. She said to Ka, "You painted me before you knew me." He said, "I painted what your mother loved. That was enough to find you." She stood there for a long time. Then she said, "I'm going to need to learn to be quiet." "Aren't I?" he said. "Not necessarily. The field is large." In the Hall of Two Truths, on the day Meritedin arrived, there was a moment that had never happened before. The hall was full. Every seat of the 42 assessors was occupied, as always. But beyond them, standing at the walls, sitting on the steps of the columns, were the souls of Aru. They had all come. They had not been summoned. No one had asked them to come. They had simply come, the way people come to something that matters, when they understand it matters. Anubis saw them and said nothing. Osiris saw them and leaned forward on his throne. The heart on the scales that day was not remarkable by ordinary measure. It was the heart of a woman who had made Lenin, loved imperfectly, said the right thing almost too late. A heart Anubis and Osiris and Thoth had seen before. But the souls of Aru had come to witness it, because it was theirs. Meritedin's heart was not light. She had been loud and certain, and sometimes wrong, and not always quick to say so. But it was honest. She had loved her mother all her life. She had wept for her. She had named a daughter for her. She had felt her mother's pride through a wall of death, and known it was real. The scale felt all of it. The scale settled. The Hall of Two Truths, a fuller than it had ever been, went still. And then it did something it had never done. The assembled souls of Aru, the dead of 300 generations, made a sound together, not a cheer, not a ceremony. Just an exhale, the sound of a held breath released, the sound of a world confirming yes. She crosses, she crosses, she crosses. Meritedin came through into Aru. The hall exhaled. And then the souls of Aru began to return to their field, their looms, their walls, their river. Nefertari showed her everything. The sycamore, the loom, the small cloth made from her own flax. The cat, who chose Meritedin immediately, which surprised no one. Meritedin was loud in Aru. The field adjusted. The grandmother, who had also never been quiet, found her and immediately began an argument about the correct way to grow flax. It was the beginning of a friendship. What the Egyptians understood, what 3,000 years of careful thinking about death had taught them, was this. The life and the afterlife were not two different things. They were the same thing, continuing. The feather of Ma'at did not ask, "Were you great? Were you famous? Were you wealthy enough to afford a fine Book of the Dead?" It asked only, "Were you true? Nefertari had been a linen maker. That was all. No temples built in her name. No paintings on palace walls. 2 years of thread and customers and 2 apprentices who stayed. And the feather had found her honest. The Egyptians knew this. They wrote it down carefully, in 3,000 years of papyrus and stone. The ordinary life, lived honestly. Ways the same as any other. The feather does not know the difference between a pharaoh's heart and a linen maker's. What you made. What you said, eventually. Who you walked beside. Whether you told the truth when it mattered. The scales knew all of it. They had always known. Osiris had been murdered and reassembled. He had chosen truth as his answer to chaos. That choice, repeated in every honest act of every honest life, was what maintained the world. Not armies, not pharaohs. Honesty daily, in small amounts. Anubis walked beside every one of them. Since the first Egyptian died, he had been in the corner of the dying room. He had never missed a death. He had never been late. He had held every trembling hand. The Book of the Dead was a gift from the living to the dying. A way of saying we have thought carefully about what comes next. We have written it down. You will not go unprepared. Here is everything we know. Nefertari's apprentices had buried her scroll with her. That was the gift. They had thought of it themselves. She had never asked them to. Some things you teach without teaching. The mother's handwriting on the first line. The scribe's careful marks after. Both kinds of love on the same papyrus. Both kinds of preparation. The love that knows you completely, and the craft that knows exactly what you need. What we carry to the scales is not the life we wished we had lived. It is the life we actually lived, with its silences, and its repairs, and its unsaid things that were finally said, and its love that came out wrong, and then came out right. That is the teaching. Not be perfect, not be great, be true, say the thing eventually. Love imperfectly, but keep trying. Name your dead, tend your craft, walk beside whoever is crossing. Maybe tonight has been a little of that, the tending, the trying. The ordinary honest work of a day. The scales, if they could speak to the living, would count all of it. The Egyptians were not afraid of death. They were afraid of an unprepared death. And their answer was not to avoid it, it was to prepare. To live in a way that made the crossing easier. To be ready. Nefertari understood, in Aru, that she had been preparing all her life. Not deliberately. By living honestly in the workshop. By making the cloth what it claimed to be. By saying the true thing in the end. The preparation was the life. She wove in Aru while Meritaten and the grandmother argued about flax. Ka painted nearby. The cat sat on the cloth. Userat measured the day's harvest. The recovered soul made her finest pattern yet. The man who thought he wasn't enough sat by the river, at peace. The boat of Ra would pass again tonight. It always did. And in the living world, the sun would rise again in the morning. It always did. Between the passing and the rising of this, the quiet field, the river, the patient God on his green throne, waiting for no one tonight, because tonight everyone was already home. Egypt is gone now, the civilization, the pharaohs, the daily practice of Ma'at in the courts and markets. But what it understood has not gone. It traveled. The scales of justice that stand in courtrooms today, in London, in Washington, in every city that inherited the Western legal tradition, are Ma'at's scales. The feather is still in the balance. The idea that the dead deserve judgment, that a life can be weighed, that honesty matters more than status, that too traveled. It is in the Abrahamic traditions. It is in the structure of every culture that asks, how did you live? Annie's Book of the Dead is in the British Museum, 23 meters. His name in it still. When you read it, when anyone reads it, Annie lives. The wren persists. It has persisted for 3,000 years. The temples of Egypt are still standing. Not all time and sand and quarrying have taken most. But enough. Karnak, a Bew symbol, the temple of Isis at Philae, which was moved stone by stone to save it from a rising reservoir. The Nile still floods. Differently now, the Aswan Dam controls it. But the river that fed Nefertari's city, that smelled of earth and distance, still runs to the sea. The river that was in the Duat is the same river. The names of the gods are still spoken. Not in worship, for most, but in study, in story, in the way a culture passes its understanding forward. Osiris, Isis, Anubis, Maat, the wren of the gods persisting. And the understanding, the essential Egyptian understanding, that what we do with our days is what we carry to the scales. That honesty is the maintenance of the world. That love, even imperfect, even badly translated, weighs something real. Nefertari is not remembered by history. No pharaoh took her name. No temple bears her inscription. But her cloth went to the temple, and Osiris remembers it. And her daughter named a granddaughter for her. And the granddaughter smiled at her loom for no reason she could name. The feather of Ma'at is lighter than history. It weighs only truth. And truth of the Egyptians knew outlasts every pharaoh, every dynasty, every empire that believed itself eternal. The feather is still here, still asking its question. Were you true? The field is quiet now. The Nile runs, the wheat stands still in no wind. Aru at rest. Nefertari sleeps under the sycamore. Ka nearby. The cat on the cloth she made from her own flax. Meritaten sleeps too loudly, as she did everything. The grandmother, nearby, does not complain. Tonight. The boat of Ra passes overhead, warm light across the sleeping field. Gone again until morning. Anubis keeps watch at the field's edge. He always does. He has watched over sleeping souls since the beginning. He is watching now. In the living world, the night is the same night. The stars above you, the same stars above the field. You don't have to prove anything tonight. The feather can wait. Tonight, just this, just rest. The river runs, the wheat stands. Somewhere a loom is still, the craft resting. Anubis at the edge, patient as stone, patient as the river. He has held every trembling hand. He will hold yours. When the time comes and it is not yet time. We'll be here when you're ready. Sleep now. The field is quiet. The feather is still. The river runs.